Hi again, this is Russ, and welcome to the next lesson in Designing Network Solutions. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about implementing a secure hybrid network. In the previous lesson, we spoke about hybrid network solutions, which is pretty much Azure Express Route as far as Microsoft is concerned. But now we need to talk about how to secure your Azure network in your hybrid environment. And this is going to involve setting up a perimeter network. This is going to work with either VPN gateway or an express route connection, however you have it set up. The components of a perimeter network are as follows. You start, of course, with your on-premises network. This is, what you've been living with forever until you decided to go to Azure. Then you've got your Azure virtual network, and that's, of course, where you're going to be hosting your applications and other resources in Azure. And there may be more than one, but you're going to be connecting to at least one in a hybrid network. Next up, you'll have your gateway. Now, the gateway is going to give you connectivity between the routers on your on-prem network and the Azure virtual network, and will be placed in its own subnet. Firewall, self-explanatory. It also gets its own subnet. Now, between all of your subnets, you're going to have NSGs to help manage the traffic between them. And in the typical model for a perimeter network, your Azure subnets can be broken up, say, in 3 tiers outside of the network appliance subnets. You may have a web services tier or a web app tier, an application server tier, and then a data tier where you'll put maybe storage and databases and the like. And you'll have NSGs handling that traffic between those tiers. And to that end, you'll also use virtual network routes. And these will define the flow of IP traffic within the virtual network if you need to restrict the traffic a little more than, say, what the NSG is going to do. And lastly, Azure has put together a nice little tool called Bastion. And this is going to let you log into your VMs in your virtual network using either SSH or RDP. And you won't expose the VMs directly to the internet, so you don't need to put public IP addresses on any of your VMs in order to connect to them and manage them. Very handy, and it's only been around comparatively short term, but it's pretty much a must these days. And here's what it's going to look like. So we start with your on-premise network, and then we're going to go to the gateway subnet. That subnet then routes traffic to the firewall, and the firewall forwards said traffic on to the web tier. You have a load balancer before your web tier VMs. The web tier talks to the app tier talks to the data tier, so forth. NSGs for each of the subnets. Azure Bastion also, you'll note, has an NSG attached to it. And then network routes, in this case, say from the load balancer of the web tier back to the firewall, and from there back to your on-premise network. Now, this architecture works for a number of uses that you'll find are pretty common. One is hybrid apps, where workloads are partly run on-prem and partly in Azure. You may have, say, an application tier on-prem, but maybe your data sources are in Azure, something like that, or the other way around, although you don't normally find a split like that too often. You have infrastructure that requires more granular control over the traffic entering the Azure virtual network from the data center. This can be important for, say, specific departments that are on specific networks on-prem, and you restrict that traffic to just those departments. So maybe this is something for, say, either security connecting to security devices or perhaps financials. And you can also have situations where apps have to audit their outgoing traffic. This is very common for regulatory requirements in a lot of commercial systems and can be used to prevent public disclosure of private information. You're routing that traffic and nobody outside the specific network that has access or the specific network that is defined for the traffic can get access to that data stream. Let's finish up with some security considerations for securing a hybrid network. You're going to route on-premise users through that firewall. You're not going to have anybody, as far as accessing applications, non-administrative personnel, going anywhere but through the firewall. And you're going to use NSGs to block or allow traffic between the application tiers. You want to make sure and organize virtual network assets in the same resource group. This is just a simple security process, but that way you don't have network appliances or something, regardless of what subnet they're in, living in different resource groups, and therefore you may have to deal with different security for each one. And you're going to want to assign RBAC roles to any resource groups, restricting that access to resources. Now, that's just a general security practice, which everybody needs to do. A brief word on how this might apply to the exam. You may see some scenario questions dealing with hybrid networks where security or the lack thereof is present in the scenario. And what you're really going to need to remember is anytime you're dealing with a perimeter network or security between an on-premise and an Azure environment, you want to make sure that some key elements are always in place. Firewalls, splitting subnets between application and data tiers, that sort of thing. Separating network assets into their own resource groups, and routing traffic between network tiers or firewalls, things like that. The idea being that you want to be controlling that traffic at all times and restricting unnecessary traffic to and from your on-premise and Azure networks. And that'll do it. So hop over to the next video and we'll sort of wrap things up for this section. We'll see you.